dynamics in Herodotus and the memory of the Roman Republic in the early Roman Empire. The title of his presentation is Finding Refuge with the Enemy, Implications of the Giving King in Herodotus. So Massimo, do we have you with us? Yes,
I'm here.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Megan, for this introduction, and thank you everyone for having me here. And it's a pleasure. It has been so many interesting talks so far, and I'm really looking forward to delivering this paper to you and to hearing your thoughts, of course. So let me share my screen. Okay. So yeah, that's the title of my presentation. And so before going to the paper itself, I just wanted to spend 30 seconds on context. Just to give you this, this context for 1 minute. And so basically, I just wanted to point out that this paper, this talk is going to be dealing with the Persian Wars and the account of the Persian Wars in Herodotus. But you should be reminded that whenever we deal with the Persian Wars and the Persians in general, actually, I'm not going to be dealing with wars a lot. But whenever we are dealing with Persians in Herodotus, we're going to have to be reminded of two different times. So one time is the time of the histories, the narrative that Herodotus covers, which is for the wars, from basically the whole of it. But then we should always be reminded that he writes all this stuff at least 50 years later, around 430, and a lot of things had happened in the meantime. And he probably writes for Athenians in Athens. So always be reminded that there is a filter between what actually happened and his own time. But moving on, in this paper, I will investigate a cluster of passages in book 6 of the Histories to bring out the implication of Herodotus' portrayal of the great king, of the Persian great king, as surprisingly benevolent towards his subjects. I first show that these episodes, when taken together, form a pattern which emphasizes Darius's magnanimity and generosity towards Greeks, whenever the latter are brought to his presence, although the context suggests we might have expected a punishment. Indeed, verbal repetition and a generally similar sequence of events link all those episodes and encourage us to look at these events as particularly meaningful, at least for Herodotus. But why are these scenes significant then? It has been suggested that episodes of this sort show that Herodotus aligns with the conception of the great king as the universal ruler, prone to wrath and to mercy alike, always reaffirming that the kingdom is his to dispose of. That Herodotus was well aware of the Near Eastern ideology of universal kingship is arguably true. Less of a concern, though, has been the reading of those same passages in light of the role of the king's subject here, namely the Greeks. In fact, Darius's beneficence towards his Greek subjects in these passages is part of a pattern of the general good treatment the Greeks received at the great king's court, a theme which runs through the whole of the histories. For the Greeks pervade the Eurasian narrative even when it is focused on Persia, and the privileges granted to them are often both disproportionate and telling. In this paper, I will attempt a reading which focuses on Herodotus' audience and contemporary political issues. In particular, I will try to show that the magnificent Persian king was a way for Herodotus to hint at the attractive power of Persia, which affected several Greek figures who were active during the Penteconst idea, whom Herodotus refers to or has in mind in the course of the histories. For Persia continued to be a force to be reckoned with down to Herodotus' own time, and continued Medizing was likely the clearest threat to the Pan-Hellenic political project. In fact, recent scholarship has shown that the closeness between Greece and Persia, and particularly between Athens and Persia, was a theme running beneath the surface of the histories, and a major political concern of Herodotus' own time. So in the first of this set of passages, at 620, Herodotus is describing the aftermath of the capture of Meletus by the Persians. This involved a quite crude deportation of the Milesians to Susa to the presence of the great King Darius. There, Herodotus says, what you got here in the PowerPoint, but the King Darius, having done no other evil to them, settled them next to the sea called Red in the city of Ampus. It is perhaps expected for Darius not to do any further harm to a people who have just become subject to his own will. Nonetheless, being reminded of the many episodes of gratuitous cruelty perpetrated by former Persian kings, I was somehow surprised by Darius's magnanimity here. Also, I think the particle de in Greek has maintained its original adversative force, and therefore suggests that the following statement is somehow unexpected in light of what has just been said. This doing no harm on Darius's part has at least 3 other equivalents in the same book, in the context of episodes that bear at the same time many resemblances and differences to this one. Following not the chronological order of the episodes as they appear in the book, but rather the level of unexpectedness Herodotus elicits in Darius' benevolence towards his subjects, I now want to mention 619, namely the stories of the Eretrians captured and brought to Darius' presence, as a consequence of the expedition of Darius and Artaphernes. The 2 Persian commanders bring the Eretrians to Susa. Here, Herodotus first explicitly mentions that Darius used to cultivate a significant hatred they non-Holland towards them, since they were the first among the non-Ionians, he implies, to begin hostilities against the Persian Empire. This notwithstanding, when he has them in his own hands, epetede, however when, he does no further evil to them, in Greek, epoise kakon allo uden. Not only then does Herodotus here describe a situation analogous to that of the Milesians, where he seems to challenge the expectation of his listeners, readers, of a possible further punishment of Darius' subjects. He does so using the exact same words. Those very words occur once again in the same book in a similar context, within the microstory of a Greek individual, Metiacus, son of Miltiades. At 641, Herodotus tells us that the Phoenicians fail in an attempt to capture Miltiades, but they manage to capture one of his ships, captained by his son Metiacus. The Phoenicians, as soon as they realized that he was a son of Miltiades, brought him at the king's presence. They did so, Herodotus notices, quote, in the hope to obtain significant gratitude, end quote, since Miltiades was the one who encouraged the Ionians to cut the bridge on the Danube, to the king's detriment, at least in Herodotus' own narrative. However, as soon as he contemplates Metiacus, he doesn't do any further harm to him. Again, Herodotus uses the exact same phrase to give the exact same image, as Darius does not do any harm to Metiacus. But here we have more, since the great king actually benefits Metiacus significantly by granting him a house, a possession, most likely in the form of land, and a Persian woman whose children had the privilege of being counted among the Persians. We don't know what happened to the Phoenicians who brought him, but it seems ironic that the only one to be rewarded here is Darius' former enemy. I conclude this section of my paper with Herodotus 630, namely the passage that deals with the death of Histiaeus. After he is captured by Artaphernes and Harpagus, Herodotus puts forth a theory of what would have happened differently had Histiaeus been brought to Darius. That's it. Not surprisingly, we could say, Herodotus states that, in his opinion, Histiaeus, quote, would have suffered no harm. Notice that this is the same construction found in the first 3 passages cited, with the only change being that of the main verb from poieo to pascho, in accordance with the shifting of the subject from Darius to Histiaeus. But Histiaeus' fate turns out to be different, since Artaphernes and Harpagus impale him on the spot, quote, fearing that he might become once again influential with the great king, end quote. Then they embalm his head and send only that to Darius. At this, the great king reproaches them for not having brought Histiaeus to his presence, and then gives a worthy burial to his head, quote, as belonging to a great benefactor, both to himself and to the Persians, end quote. This is again striking, since Herodotus clearly presents Histiaeus as one of the main instigators of the Ionian revolt, and one who deceived the great king out of the hope of going back to Ionia. What makes Darius' benevolence even more significant here is that this implies a strong tension within the imperial system of power, since obviously the set of Artaphernes had very different ideas about how to deal with that fugitive. The text simply says that Darius accused both Artaphernes and Harpagus, but the imbalance is nonetheless significant. To judge from the similar sequence of events which links those episodes, and from the usage of the same sequence of words to describe Darius' generosity, I believe that these scenes constitute what Imervar called narrative patterning, in which Herodotus uses repetitions to link various episodes together into narrative units out of which he created a large unified work. Such displays of generosity by the great king in the histories have generally been interpreted as simply reflecting an Oriental narrative centered around the munificence of the great king. In particular, several studies have paused on the great king's notorious behavior of pondering good versus bad deeds when it came to deal with prisoners. However, I believe the focus can be shifted to the recipients of Darius's benefits in our passages, when one realizes that they are all Greeks. And from other Herodotian passages, it is clear that Greeks in Herodotus were granted a special place within the Persian system of power. Individuals like the physician Democedes, the diviner Onamacritus, or some Greek generals from the islands in the Persian fleet occupy center stage in the narrative as close associates to the great king. The consistency with which these Greeks are spared, well treated, and even rewarded is indeed striking. Thus, the passages in Book 6 that we employ to open the discussion are perfectly in accordance with what happens elsewhere in the histories, notwithstanding the initial element of surprise given the nature of the context in which they appear. The Greek centrism of the histories emerges here with extreme clarity. Herodotus' own audience must have inspired him to a larger role and the treatment granted to Greeks in Persia, as Briand notes. In relation to narrative patterning, many scholars, such as Fornara, have shown that Herodotus tended to use certain narrative strategies to hint at events that extend beyond the time of the histories proper, namely those developments that a contemporary audience might have considered as politically relevant. Therefore, Herodotus' continuous attention to this aspect of the Greek-Persian relationship could have further implications if we consider another time, namely not that of the histories, but Herodotus' own, asking how this Persian benevolence towards Greeks might have functioned in the narrative of a text written and performed at Athens during the Pentecontaetia. In the last section of my paper, I propose that by means of these narratives of Greeks who are benefited by the great king, Herodotus anticipates the vicissitudes of some other Greeks of his own time who ended up medizing and encourages his audience to draw these parallels. In so doing, Herodotus could also suggest what it was that rendered the very acts of medizing alluring, namely, that it granted a life of luxury and political relevance under a benevolent king. For Herodotus could use the Persian trajectory from hard to soft culture as a warning to the Greeks themselves, as exemplified by the story of Pausanias. Also, he could silently offer a critical evaluation of medizing as a form of Persian conquest alternative to the use of brute force, which was still fully at work even when force failed. This model of thinking allows us to appreciate further developments in the Herodotian narrative that might have escaped us in the first place. That the Samians, for instance, were notorious throughout the 5th century for their attempts at medizing seems to be reflected in the consistency with which Herodotus depicts them as having power and prestige at the court of the great king. A certain Siloson, a Samian, is presented as being the first Greek ever rewarded by Darius, in a narrative sequence that stresses once again what we might call the unexceptional exceptionality. And you have this passage here. And who is this Greek benefactor to whom I owe thanks, since I just have the kingship? Either one Greek or no one has come to our place and have no debt towards any Greek man. Guess what? He's going to have a debt with this one, and he's going to reward him. The same is true for the passages in Book 6 we use as a springboard to our discussion. If Darius really granted to the captured Eretrians some benefits, Artaxerxes could have made similar concessions to the same people who tried to medize in 453, as testified by epigraphy. It is not impossible, though difficult to demonstrate, that those Eretrians heard from their fellow countrymen in Persia. Revolts and civil strife in the late 50s are attested in the case of Meletus as well. And though no Persian agency is explicitly mentioned, it is perfectly possible that charges of medizing, true or alleged, were made in order to get rid of political adversaries. But it is mostly with benefits granted to individuals that Herodotus seems to develop this model of hinting at later outcomes. If we go back to Meletus, we may notice that some elements of his trajectory could remind the Herodotian audience of that of later figures. That he was given a Persian woman as a wife can help but remind us of one of Pausanias' requests as he approaches the great king. In a letter he allegedly composed and which was recorded by Thucydides in 128.7. Pausanias, sovereign of Sparta, sends you this man. having captured them in war, wants to please you, and I propose if you agree to marry your daughter and to make Sparta and the rest of Greece subject to you. I think I'm able to achieve this if you support me. If they like this condition, send a faithful man to see through whom we may negotiate our terms in the future. Here, Pausanias grants the king that he would make Sparta subject to Persia. More interestingly, he asks for the privilege of marrying Xerxes' own daughter. That request will obviously not be satisfied, but is nonetheless indicative of Pausanias' willingness to become a real Persian. In fact, later on in the Archaeologia, Thucydides describes Pausanias' entrance at Byzantium, quote, in a Median dress, attended by a bodyguard of Medes and Egyptians, keeping a Persian table, end quote. That Herodotus was also interested in Pausanias' sudden change of attitude towards Persia is proven by a passage in Book 9, whose ironical reading seems inescapable. There, Pausanias admires the splendor of Mardonius' own tent, as he orders 2 meals to be prepared, one in the fashion of Persians and the other of Spartans. He then comments, men of Greece, I gather you here for this reason, since I wanted to show you the foolishness of this leader of the Persians, who, having such a way of living, came against us who have such a miserable one, to deprive us of this. Pausanias' thoughts about the foolishness of Mardonius betrays him as an admirer of Persian luxury. This is another example where the time frame of the history is proper, did not allow Herodotus to fully describe later developments concerning a historical figure, though it didn't prevent him from leaving hints. Like Pausanias, Metiacus is the embodiment of the everlasting possibility for Greeks to be corrupted by Eastern wealth and luxury. A similar pattern can be observed if we consider the Herodotean treatment of the figure of Histiaeus. We underline the grip the Herodotean Histiaeus apparently still held on Darius, to the point that it clearly created a tension between Darius himself and his Persian subjects, who evidently consider him as a rival. The exceptionality of the role of Histiaeus within the court hierarchy must have reminded an Athenian audience of what had happened to Themistocles, whose presence at the great king's court was so prominent that, in Plutarch's works, quote, he became hateful to those in power. For the honors he enjoyed were nothing like those of other foreigners, but he joined the king in hunts and in household hobbies, so that he used to see the king's mother and became familiar with her. And when the king ordered, he even listened to the words of the Magi. His honor exceeded those usually granted to foreigners. Notice in particular the reference to his familiarity with the king's mother, as another case of a Persian woman being mentioned as the final proof that someone has become a real Persian. The popularity of Themistocles' story makes it likely that Herodotus wanted to present Histiaeus as another, lesser-known Themistocles, with the close relations and influence he had over the great king, to the point of eliciting jealousy in the satraps. Another feature which links Histiaeus to Themistocles is their common role as political representatives of Persia in strategic places at the border between the two worlds. For Persia's alluring power consisted not only in the wealth that being a member of such a splendid court could give, but also in the political centrality Persian kings could grant to their Greek advisors. As Briand notes, the historical reality seems to suggest that, even though the great king used Greek representatives consistently, this was mainly for the relations they maintained with the Greek cities. This is, again, something that Herodotus never fails to notice. Histiaeus' political power in a place of strategic importance is evident, but one must notice that elsewhere, Herodotus is still consistent in hinting at the roles of these first-order Greeks as recipients of land grants, either as proper tyrants or as simple administrators. Many of these figures, like Demaratus and Hippias, were politically dead in their homeland and looked for rehabilitation in Persia. Among the later figures, whom Herodotus touches only tangentially, the same fate belongs to the aforementioned Pausanias and Themistocles, who perfectly exploit the charge of medism directed at them to make a good impression on the great king. Another figure who sees Persia as a perfect opportunity for a political springboard after his previous failure is Alcibiades, who, after a brief but intense stay in Persia, manages to acquire once again a predominant role in Athenian politics. Therefore, it seems a strong possibility that Herodotus used the great king's benevolence towards Greeks as a way of addressing the issue of this constant flow of individuals and peoples in Persia. The image of the merciful king encompassed all the stories of Greeks in Persia, while at the same time standing as a symbol of all the benefits that were open to any Greek who wished to change sides. Clearly, this also meant a much more subtle threat to the stability of the Greek world than that posed by open war. Herodotus seems to suggest that Persia could still conquer Greece by incorporating its inhabitants within the Persian borders with the prospect of a life of luxury and or political relevance. In this paper, I used 4 episodes in Herodotus' book 6 as a case study for analyzing what could lie beneath Herodotus' presentation of Persian great kings as being extremely generous towards Greeks. I moved the focus from the omnipotent king of the Persian narrative to considering these passages as being part of a Greek narrative, mainly intended for a Greek audience of the second half of the 5th century, where Persia was ideologically reframed and made dangerously closer to Greece and Athens. In fact, I observed that the given king was an embodiment of Persia's alluring power towards Greeks, and that those who benefit from him might recall other, more significant figures who, in the course of the Pentagon Theia, turned to the king and obtained privileges in the form both of simple prestige and political relevance. And these are the main works I quoted. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you guys. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. We don't have any audience questions just yet. So everyone, if you do have a question for Massimo, please put them in the chat. We will move on to the next person. I did want to ask something that I run into a lot with Herodotus as an Assyriologist is maybe the lack of accuracy, let's say, for dealing with foreign cultures. Do you think he is more reliable for as a reflection of Greek views, both of themselves and then of the cultures that they come into contact with?
More reliable, like in general?
Do you think what he says about Persians maybe reflects more what the Greeks think of Persians rather than what Persians themselves would maybe describe as themselves?
So yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. Recently, like it has been shown that Herodotus used Persian sources a lot as well. So obviously there is this conflict that it's obviously difficult to determine exactly how much, like, okay, this is Persian, this is Greek. Like, I think that's almost an impossible exercise. He wasn't just interested in Persia. He had material from those places. What I would like to say though, is that I really believe in the direct or indirect capacity of the audience of orientating how you tell something, how you present a material. So even though, like, obviously Herodotus tried to gather sources from all over the world, of course he spoke with Egyptian priests and so on and so forth. I believe that especially when Greeks were more or less concerned, he tried, I don't want to say that he tried to give them what they wanted, but he tried to, at least as it tried to show, to enlarge the role of Greeks there. So in a sense, it's not even true that he was more faithful whenever it came to the Greeks, because I mean, the Greeks were, in a sense, they were always there. But I mean, in this respect is like, it's just difficult to tell. But yes, I think it's, instead of saying what faithful versus not faithful, we might want to reframe the question like, people should, like, it's legitimate to think that like those people, those audience, like had to be interested in what he was saying, not only in terms of like, this is just a good story, I want to hear that, and especially whenever I don't even want to say whenever he got there, but even when he came close to dealing with some affairs that we might want to call like that deal with politics. Like whenever something like came close to Athenian ideology, for example, I don't want to say that he was just like the mouthpiece of that, but at least that he was reflective of that, reflective of the ideology of Greece, and especially of Athens, that was development in those years, and that is where this whole argument falls. I mean, this whole like openness of Persia was like Herodotus wanted to ring a bell in the spectators. Like, I mean, Persia is still there. It's not that since I'm telling this story and we defeated them, it's over. It's kind of like, it's something that we still see.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's an excellent and very full answer. We don't have any audience questions, so I will let you go and we can move on to our next presenter. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
On